At 2 a.m., Ring sent me a motion alert. My fiancée and her lover were kissing in the hall, pressed against the wall. Then she said, "Don't worry, he won't be back until morning." When I arrived 10 minutes later, I had learned to sleep in pieces. Night shifts at the hospital carved the week into fragments. And in those fragments, I did the living other people took for granted. Dinner that didn't taste like adrenaline, laundry that didn't smell like antiseptic, a weekend where I could pretend normality still existed. Mara knew my schedule because I said it out loud, on purpose. I told her the days I would be at the hospital so she could plan around me. She asked once if the late shifts made me lonely. I told her loneliness was a different problem and that we would talk about it later. 2 o'clock in the morning, I was still awake, sending a chart update when my phone vibrated with a Ring motion alert. The notification said movement detected at 2:03 a.m., hall camera. I tapped the preview out of habit, thinking maybe a stray cat or the building's cleaning crew. The feed loaded and the hallway came into focus. Dim light from the street, the doormat, the faint reflection of the building number on the polished floor. Then two shadows leaned into each other too, close to be casual. Mara pressed against the wall, her head tipped, and a man I did not know held her there. They were kissing in a way that had no patience left for secrecy. At one point she turned her head and something was audible on the clip, a voice that reassured with a sentence I could parse even through the cheap microphone. "He won't be back until morning." Hearing it felt like the floor beneath me had been pulled out. There was no plan, only motion. I dropped the tablet, grabbed keys, and ran to the truck. The drive from the hospital to my building is 12 minutes on a good night. Between the lights and the speed, 12 minutes felt like an hour. I replayed the clip in my head with an irrational hope that the motion alert had lied, that I had misread the angle, that my life still had the dishonest comfort of not knowing. When I pulled in, the man walked out of the stairwell and into view. He looked ordinary in a way that made everything worse. An everyday haircut, a sweatshirt with a displaced logo, the tired arrogance of someone who assumes consequences are someone else's problem. He did not run when he saw me. He flattened against the opposite wall like a man hoping to be ignored by the story he had stepped into. Mara's hair was loose when she saw me, and for a moment I watched how quickly people switch between versions of themselves, the one who hides and the one who explains. I opened the door without announcing myself, and the apartment smelled like cheap cologne and spilled wine. Clothes lay over the back of the couch. A plate in the sink had dried sauce at the rim. I had imagined confrontation 1,000 ways, a shout, an argument, a scene that would shred everything neat and reveal the raw center. This was none of that. It was small, domestic, and filthy with familiarity. The man started to move, then hesitated. Our neighbor from across the hall, someone I'd seen in the stairwell, stepped into the doorway because the noise had turned the building's head. She had a flashlight and eyes that cataloged details. She'd seen Mara with other men in the hallway once a few weeks ago and told herself not to judge. It turns out she had noticed more than she'd admitted. I could have done the televised version. I could have grabbed the man and dragged him through the lobby, could have made everyone watch and pointed at the ring on my finger until someone decided who the villain was. Instead, I did something quieter that felt colder by degrees. I pulled out the phone and tapped the ring, recording into an app where it would stay untouched. I saved the timestamp. I recorded the hush between the two of them when they realized the house was no longer theirs to occupy. Mara's voice in the doorway came fast and full of practiced hurt. She begged for explanation. She claimed drunkenness, a momentary lapse, an apology that had been rehearsed somewhere before this night. I listened to it the way a surgeon listens to a patient, attentive but detached. The neighbor watched, and when the man tried to step past me to get to the stairwell, she blocked him with a directness that surprised both of us. He stuttered excuses, a string of fragments, and then he left because he had nowhere to stand. I left too. I did not stay to yell about promises or to throw plates at the sink. I walked out of my own apartment with evidence saved in pockets that felt suddenly heavy. My truck was a cage of silence on the street. I drove until the city signs read differently and then parked under a diner's light, where coffee still meant something to the moonlit few. I pulled the footage up again, not because I needed to see it, but because I did not yet know what to do with the anger. The clip showed everything that had happened, the way they had eased into each other, the soft words, the shirt he had left behind on the couch when he fled. The camera had even caught his license plate as he came down the street with me, a small detail that planted itself like a seed in my mind. There is a moment, after shock, when people split into two camps, those who explode and those who plan. I do not come from a place that enjoys spectacle. I had whispered vows with Mara in a chapel that smelled like old wood and lilies, and I had invested in the future in ways that now felt foolish. I could have called her parents from the phone booth across from the diner and demanded everything. I could have gone back and torn the apartment apart until the man cried uncle. Instead, an idea formed because I wanted consequences that would not be undone by a clever apology. On the table in front of me, the ring lay heavy on my palm after I had taken it off. I kept my fingers around it a long time, and then, with a movement that felt both decisive and terrible, I put it back on. It was not a signal of forgiveness. It was armor. I would not allow the story to be only shame in public, because shame can be washed away and forgotten. I would build consequences so precise they could not be undone with hollow words. I would use the footage, but not in the way Mara expected. I would trace the license plate, get names, and follow money where it led. I would make the financial world and the people who fund weddings understand that this had cost me more than sleep. When the dawn came thin over the diner, I drove home with a plan that had nothing to do with spectacle. The man's face in the ring footage had not jotted off into oblivion. It had left fingerprints across my life that could be followed. I sat in my car outside the building and wrote down the first steps. Capture everything, catalog the money, call the bank about suspicious transactions, ask the landlord about lease options. The list was careful and slow like a medical chart. It felt right. I walked up the stairs and opened the door to find the couch as it had been, the wine glass exactly where it had been. Mara was there with a towel around her shoulders and a face that had been made small by sleeplessness or the knowledge that the world had narrowed to her mistakes. I did not speak at first. I had no room for the wild, messy, moralizing people like to perform for visitors. There would be time for an explosion later, if that suited me. For now, I wanted something else, an outcome that would not be erased by a single apology. I told her I would be gone for a few days. I told her I needed space to think. I left the ring footage saved in 3 separate places and then sat in my car until the sun came up, planning the revenge that would not be over in a night. I did not want a spectacle. I wanted something that lasted. The first thing I did was secure the footage. I copied the ring clip to 3 separate drives and uploaded one to a cloud account with a timestamped hash. It felt obsessive, but that kind of detail matters when people try to water down truth with story. I labeled the files with the exact time and the camera ID and sent a single encrypted copy to Elijah at work with a message that said only, "Look." Elijah had been one of the few people who treated our relationship like a partnership rather than a headline. He understood chain of custody in a way I did not yet, and I trusted him to keep it cold until I told him what to do next. I did not call Mara's parents. I did not call her friends. Those calls are fireworks, fast, loud, and forgettable. Instead, I sat with a ledger and my own bank statements and treated the situation like a problem in slow chemotherapy. Attacked the patient precisely, not with random violence. I wanted money removed from her reach and support networks to recalculate their math without their sentimental wiring. The wallet I kept in my truck held pieces of the man who had been on my couch. His license plate in the ring feed had been smudged, but the camera angle caught his face long enough for me to run it through a service that pulled car registration details. I did not need to be a cop to find his name. I didn't need to be careful about how I used that name. I wrote it down and then locked the paper in the glove compartment. When I looked at the apartment lease, I found something I had not paid attention to before. The payment schedule showed recurring transfers that had passed between accounts at odd hours. Some of those transfers were earmarked for the venue and the caterer. Others were to an account that had no obvious name. A few small vendors had been paid from my joint account on Mara's card and then refunded to a different account. That is where I tightened the net. I called the bank on a Tuesday afternoon and asked to speak to fraud. I did not accuse anyone. I asked questions, pulled up dates, and then, because the bank rep asked for a reason, I said I believed there had been unauthorized transfers and that I needed them placed on hold while I investigated. The rep put the transactions in review, and a provisional credit appeared on the screen. It was not a victory. It was a point of leverage. The bank wanted documentation. The documentation is where people like me win or lose. That documentation arrived in the form of a woman who sat down across from me in a coffee shop and did not smile. Her name was Sophie, and she did not speak my name when she introduced herself. She did not need to learn it. She had come with a fistful of receipts and a file folder of texts. She had recognized Zach's license plate months ago when he started parking near her building, and then she had found charges on her account that she could not explain. Her boyfriend, she said, had been missing small amounts of money for weeks until she confronted him and found messages to another woman. She had left him. She had not come to cry. She had come to trade stories. We compared notes, and the map that emerged was uglier than either of us thought. Zach had a pattern. There were small but repeated transfers from women's joint accounts into his. He kept a ledger of favors and debts that he erased with little transfers. Mara's name appeared more than once in his phone. I showed Sophie the ring footage. She did not flinch when she saw him. Instead, she slid her own screenshots across the table, screenshots of charges that matched dates he had told her he was working late. Together, the two piles of paper made a single accusation. Sophie and I did not romanticize revenge. We filed a police report for fraud that afternoon. We handed over bank statements and the ring clip and the license plate and a clean narrative of dates and transfers. The officer who took our report did not promise fireworks, but he did promise an investigation and suggested we speak to the bank about cooperating with law enforcement. He advised caution and wrote down a badge number in case anything went sideways. That badge number felt more like an ally than anything else. After the police report, I called the landlord. I explained that I was moving out. I did not explain why in anything more than practical terms. I had learned enough to know landlords hate being surprised, so I offered the simplest solution. Release me from the lease and allow Mara to apply as the sole tenant. Landlords run credit checks. They do not take sides. If Mara could qualify, she would be on the hook for rent without my protections. The landlord agreed to discuss the change pending a credit check and a signed assignment form, and I asked Elijah to be my witness on the paperwork. Elijah had seen my shift schedules and could attest to my inability to be home some nights. He could provide context that would make the paperwork clean. That move looked small on paper, but it was a hinge. If Mara's credit score or bank statements did not satisfy the landlord, she would be denied. Either way, she would be forced to explain to her parents and whoever else had been funding the wedding that her financial state was visible and not necessarily stable. I did not want to evict her. I wanted her to be the one who had to ask for support. With the bank and police reports in motion, Sophie and I took a second step that required restraint and patience. We compiled a package for the venue and the major vendors that had been paid through accounts tied to Mara and to the account Zach was using. It was a simple letter, proof of a police report, the disputed transactions, and a formal request to hold any refunds until the investigation concluded. I did not demand a refund. I asked the vendor to freeze funds. Vendors hate freezing funds, and that is precisely why they listen. A frozen refund buys time for the legal work to catch up with the domestic drama. I also started texting Mara in carefully measured sentences. I told her I was filing for time to think and that she should not leave town. The texts were signed with threat and signed only with consequence. They were notes meant to shape behavior rather than to punish in the moment. She called, sobbing into the phone. I let it ring out. I did not want to be the man who allowed performances to reset the score. At night, the insomnia arrived in sets. I would wake at 2 and think of the ring camera's grainy angle and the way their bodies had fit together like a secret puzzle. I cross-checked the dates and the charges until they made a map I could follow. I watched relationships in a surgical light. People are messy, but money is clean. Money leaves trails that people rarely clean. Before the end of the week, I had a legal advisor draft a letter I planned to use if the bank's provisional credit did not result in agreed reversals. The letter threatened small claims and detailed the chain of evidence. I did not want to take the fight into court, but a letter from a lawyer tends to tighten the screws in polite society. It signals that the mess will cost someone more than embarrassment. The net was not yet closed, but it was set. Sophie had agreed to cooperate with police and bank investigators. The landlord would consider an assignment pending credit checks. The vendors had agreed to freeze payments if we provided paperwork. I had moved my life into a temporary rental, a neutral place where I could receive mail and manage phone calls without the smell of the apartment haunting me. I spent hours compiling a timeline for the detective assigned to our case, and when Elijah offered to host me for a night or two if needed, I accepted. This was not revenge as theater. It was a series of traps designed to make the consequences inevitable. I believed in pressure applied precisely over time, and I believed that people who built lives on convenient lies were vulnerable where their livelihoods intersected with reality. If Zach had indeed been siphoning money, a police investigation could ruin him. If the bank reversed transactions, Mara would be exposed to the people who had paid for the wedding. If the landlord refused to assign the lease, she would suddenly need to explain how she intended to pay rent without my name attached. By the weekend, we had started to see movement. The bank called to ask for more documentation and placed a temporary hold on the largest transfers. The officer assigned the case took our statements seriously enough to schedule follow-up interviews. Sophie texted me a receipt that showed Zach went to an ATM at 2 in the morning on a date that matched a missing transfer. It was small, but in the net I was creating, small things matter. When I sat on the couch in the temporary place and looked at my hands, the ring felt heavier than before. It had become less ornamental and more like a token of a contract I intended to dissolve with precision. I did not want to watch Mara break in front of other people. I wanted her support to evaporate quietly and absolutely so that her mistakes could not be patched over with a favor or a gift. The next step was the scariest. We had compiled enough to make a stronger move, but executing it required timing and allies. It would be a move that would not merely humiliate, but would take things people assume are permanent: money, reputation, shelter, and make them unstable. I set a day in my head for the moment when those dominoes would start to fall, and then I slept for the first time in 3 nights without waking at 2. We had patience on our side and proof in hand. That combination changes the way people move. When you can show a paper trail, the options narrow for anyone who prefers improvisation. Sophie and I met the detective in a small room at the precinct. He was thorough without spectacle. He took the ring clip, the bank statements, the receipts Sophie brought, and the dates I had compiled. When he ran the license plate and the name tied to it, he frowned and then passed the file across the desk. The name had a notation: pending investigation in another borough for similar activity. That detail folded the case into something bigger than our lives. The detective made a cold call to the other precinct and came back with a single instruction: do not confront Zach alone. If there was a ring of activity, they wanted coordinated action. Within 24 hours, officers from 2 precincts moved on leads simultaneously. They interviewed Sophie's ex and a woman in the other borough who had reported missing transfers. The net was closing. Meanwhile, I pushed the financial side harder. The bank placed provisional credits back into the accounts affected by the largest transfers and asked us for affidavits. I signed mine and attached a copy of the ring footage. A bank investigator called to say they had flagged the account Zach used and were tracing where the money had gone. They were not going to reverse every transaction, but they would follow the trail and work with police. That meant the funds that were supposed to underwrite the wedding were no longer accessible until the review finished. Mara called me and left a message pleading for a meeting. I did not return the call. Public apologies are easy and cheap. I was working on outcomes that required contracts, documents, and third parties to take action. She showed up at the temporary address I had given Elijah and left an envelope on his porch. Inside was a note and a series of receipts that tried to explain transfers as loans repaid for business expenses. Elijah put the envelope on his kitchen table without comment and texted me a picture. The receipts looked improvised. The next morning, a vendor called. The caterer had been paid in full, but had also received a notice from the bank about disputed charges. They called to ask whether we wanted to delay their deposit. I asked them to freeze any further work until the investigation resolved. The wedding planner, realizing their own liability, sent a formal letter to Mara asking for clarity and proof of funds. Vendors are practical. They defend against risk before they consider loyalty. 2 days later, the police coordinated a pickup. They closed in on a location where Zach worked evenings. The other precinct had been watching him for weeks and finally had probable cause tied to multiple small victims. Officers arrested him without a scene in the lobby of a cheap gym where he trained clients. The arrest was not made for kissing in a hallway. It was for a pattern of financial exploitation. When they booked him, fingerprints linked him to records that showed aliases and other names. The booking photo was grim and smaller than the face on the ring clip, but the lie it exposed was larger than either of us. That arrest changed the dynamic overnight. A person who had felt untouchable now had a mugshot circulating among people who had been hurt. The detective told me the arrest gave weight to the bank's suspicions and accelerated their review. The vendors moved from freeze to rescind in a few cases, and the largest of the vendor refunds went into provisional holds pending the outcome of the criminal case. For Mara, that meant not only shame, but a practical shortage of funds. Her parents called, and the tone of their questions shifted from surprise to accounting. They asked for documentation and proof the wedding could proceed without risk. Mara could not produce it. That is where the legal pressure found its second lever. I had arranged for a lawyer to send the venue a single formal notice that outlined the pending criminal investigation and the disputed transactions tied to the wedding payments. The venue, worried about reputational risk and contractual liability, paused everything while their counsel reviewed the paperwork. A pause in a wedding chain has immediate consequences. Deposits are held, subcontractors are alerted, and refunds become complex. The cost of delay is not just money, it is leverage. Mara tried to frame the situation differently on social media, posting vague pleas about betrayal and asking for privacy. Few people engaged beyond the first comments. The ones who mattered had been asked for money or time and now had open questions about where their funds had gone. Her parents, after consulting a lawyer, froze further transfers. They were careful, practical people who did not want their names attached to potential fraud. Their call to Mara was brutal in its simplicity: provide evidence of solvency or expect us to withdraw support. They withdrew. With the bank and police doing their work, the landlord completed the credit check on Mara and found several small loans she had not disclosed. That made the assignment of the lease conditional in a way that required her to either produce a guarantor or pass a stricter verification process. I had not engineered the loans. They were a byproduct of the pattern that had begun to appear once we traced transactions back to accounts associated with her name. The landlord told Mara, gently and without malice, that he could not make an exception. He offered her one final month to secure a guarantor. It is a strange thing to watch someone's safety net fray in paperwork. The last move in this phase was administrative and surgical. I filed a formal complaint with the credit bureau documenting the disputed transactions and provided the police report number. That complaint did not by itself ruin credit, but it prompted a review flag that would slow any application for new loans and complicate her access to new lines of credit. If she wanted to rebuild through borrowing, she had to explain the dispute on file. That explanation would now live in paperwork and in bank's decision trees the way reputation does. By the end of the week, the immediate consequences were clear. Zach was in custody, major vendor payments were frozen, Mara's parents had stopped transfers, and her housing options had narrowed. The narrative had shifted from a late-night betrayal to an unfolding investigation that touched multiple institutions. I had not shouted her name from the roof. I had made sure the institutions people rely on for stability did the shouting for me. There was one final shock I had not expected. In a folder the detective handed me, there was a list of names, women Zach had targeted. One of them had been friends with Mara's sister and had lived in the same town a year before. The connections spiraled outward, showing how small actions ripple through networks. I realized then that the revenge I had designed was not just about retribution. It was about removing the scaffolding of lies and forcing a collapse that revealed what had been propped up by convenience. I slept poorly that night, but with a strange steadiness. The dominoes were in motion. The next phase would be the hardest, converting institutional action into real consequences that Mara could not paper over. Things folded faster than I expected once the institutions decided to move. Arrests and freezes are allowed on paper, but their real violence is slow and tidy. Paperwork, phone calls, formal letters that take away options. Zach's arraignment was the first public moment. The detective called me with a time and a request to be available if they needed a statement. I went to court and sat in the back with Sophie and a few other women who had become a small coalition. Seeing him in the glass box felt anticlimactic. He was smaller in person, not from sympathy, but from the practical compression of a man who had been reduced to a charged file. The charges lined up: fraudulent transfers, identity obfuscation, and a string of complaints that justified pretrial detention. The judge set bail high enough that none of the women I'd spoken to could imagine him out anytime soon. While the criminal case moved forward, the civil pieces we had set in motion began to bite. The bank returned several provisional credits to accounts that had been cleared of evidence tying them to legitimate debts. The biggest transfers that had underwritten parts of the wedding did not go back to Mara's control. Instead, the bank placed them into an escrow account, pending the criminal outcome and civil claims. The venue and several vendors signed onto the freeze and agreed to coordinate with the bank and detectives. That was the moment a planned wedding stopped being only about promises and became a ledger problem. Mara's parents called first asking for an explanation and then for receipts. I sent them the ring clip with timestamps and a simple note: check with your counsel. They did. After a week filled with lawyer meetings, they pulled the rest of their pledged support and demanded that any remaining vendor payments be returned until the case resolved. They were practical people. The idea of their names connected to potential fraud changed their math and their loyalty. Their withdrawal was a precise kind of abandonment. The landlord's decision followed predictably. Mara failed the guarantor check. Without a sponsor and with a flagged credit inquiry in her file, the landlord did not assign the lease to her solely. He offered her the month he had promised, and then, because small businesses are cruelly efficient, he filed for a standard eviction when paperwork did not appear. Eviction is paperwork and notices and then logistics, and by the time Mara realized the bank would not release funds, movers had been scheduled, and her name appeared on a list for a share house in a part of town that fits people who are moving down. There were more personal consequences that hit under the skin. The planner she had chosen closed off the weekend she had booked and refused to reschedule under the same contract. The guests, tipped off by a couple of vendors who had been inconvenienced, began to murmur. Mara's social profile flattened. The sympathetic posts died out as people checked bank accounts and discovered they had been part of disputed transactions. Supporters who had once reshared her pleas suddenly had to decide whether to be seen backing someone with an unresolved fraud claim. Most chose distance. What I had not expected was the way restitution rippled outward. The detective and bank worked together to trace at least part of the money to a brokerage account Zach used for short-term transfers. Prosecutors moved to freeze that account as evidence. The court later ordered a provisional restitution to the people who had reported losses, with the understanding that the funds would be distributed if the criminal case proved the transfers were fraudulent. It felt clinical and small, But for Sophie and others it meant they recovered a slice of what had been taken. Mara tried to mount defense strategies that were part apology, part legal technicality. She hired a lawyer who argued that some transfers were legitimate reimbursements and that she had been manipulated into sharing account details. It bought time at trial, but it did not restore her finances. Civilly, vendors sought damages for canceled services, and the venue pursued contractual penalties for delays that cost them subcontractor deposits. The law moved like a machine doing heavy work. It did not humiliate, it did the accounting. Months after the arrest, the criminal case concluded with a plea that acknowledged the pattern of exploitation. Zach received a sentence that included restitution and a prohibition on certain types of financial activity. It was not perfect justice. Criminal courts rarely make people whole. But the conviction closed the door on his ability to operate the way he had. That outcome fed into the civil side. The court's findings simplified vendor claims and reinforced the bank's reversals. For Mara, the consequences were practical and permanent in ways apologies cannot fix. She lost the apartment, lost the wedding, and lost the financial support of people who had stood ready to fund what they thought was a stable future. The credit flag on her file complicated any immediate attempt to rebuild through loans. Employers she had relied on began to ask cautious questions when she applied for positions that required financial trust. A handful of acquaintances who had been close enough to know her family's money quietly withdrew interactions. It is possible to recover from all that, but the recovery curve is long, and it happens with small humiliations like declined applications, guarantor rejections, and friends who stop returning calls. As for me, the revenge I designed did the work I intended without the fireworks I had once imagined. I recovered part of the funds through the bank's reversals and the court-ordered restitution. I used a portion of that recovery to ensure Sophie and a couple of the other victims received immediate relief for bank charges that had drained their accounts. I also paid the venue's administrative fees directly so that subcontractors who could not wait would not be left unpaid because of the freeze. It felt cleaner to use recovered money to repair harm than to keep it as a trophy. I walked away the day I delivered the last check to the venue and watched them reassign the weekend to another couple. I left a short note in the folder where the planner kept contracts. Things that are built on someone else's theft do not last. I did not want to gloat. I wanted the work to be measured and irreversible in its practical effects. The ring I had once worn came off and stayed off. I kept a photograph of the ring clip in a private folder, and that was enough. Months later, Mara moved into a thin room and took a job at a cafe. Her parents paid for a short-term stipend that would keep her fed while she worked. She texted once, asking if there was any way to talk. I did not answer. The cost of answering felt like a liable action. It would reopen a ledger I had balanced. The revenge was not cinematic. It was administrative and precise. It removed the scaffolding the affair had relied on: money, an accomplice who profited, and the illusion of stability. Institutions did the heavy lifting once evidence met process. That is a kind of justice that cannot be screamed away or undone with a staged apology. It is slower, and for that reason it is harder to ignore.